Welcome to the second OWASP Belgium virtual chapter meeting of 21. Obviously, because of COVID, we're doing our meetings virtually now. Hopefully, in a couple of months, we'll be back to in person, but for now, it's all remote. With that, we have the possibility to have and to fly in virtually people from all over the world. And normally, we would have had Steve Springett, but unfortunately had to cancel beyond his control. But we found Christian Folini to be able to fill in on very short notice. So thank you very much, Christian, for joining us. He'll be talking us through a very interesting tale of online voting in Switzerland. Before that, let me also pitch to you that we do this kind of virtual chapter meetings each month, each third Thursday of the month at around 5 o'clock in the evening, Central European time. We do one talk of about 1 hour. In the next coming months, we'll have Simon on ZAP, we'll have Jeremiah Grossman on Attack Surface, Mark Curfey on AWS, Andrew van der Stok in September will be talking about the new OWASP Top 10 of this year. And then Steve, normally who would have come today, has been switched with Christian. So Christian, instead of fall, it's a spring session you're doing, but from what I understand, it's a presentation already gave before. So thank you very much for doing that. I think the first time that we met Christian is probably like more than 10 years ago. We were talking about web application firewalls on one of the conferences that we organized in Europe. It's a long time ago. I don't even know how long ago it was.
I think it must have been 2007 or 8 in Amsterdam.
Oh yeah, that's quite possible. But indeed, yeah, it's a long time ago. Christian's specialization is, well, it knows a little bit about application firewalls. Not only a little bit, he is the project lead within OWASP together with a colleague of you on mod security core rule set, which I highly recommend. Obviously, it's the most used application firewall over the world. It's open source mod security, but together with the core rule set, you have a very good starting position there. But it's not about that Christian's going to, I would say, explain us or talk about this during this session. It's about online voting in Switzerland, and that's something, from what I understand, you do a lot in Switzerland. You have some experience with. So I'll give the word to you, Christian, and I would say, give us some explanation. Tell us your story.
Thank you very much, Seba. I'm trying to share my screen now. Yes. You see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for the introduction, Seba. Welcome to my talk. So my name is Christian Folini. I'm a Swiss medievalist who somehow ended up in the IT security industry. That's another tale. Yet the tale that I'm going to talk about tonight or today is the adventure tale of online voting in Switzerland. This is a presentation that I did in early February at the Usenix Enigma conference. That was online as well. It usually happens in San Francisco that time of the year. And I was planning to adopt it for your OWASP Belgium chapter, but then I had to switch spots. So you still have the generally slides only. I entered OWASP BE on the front slide and removed one of the logos. I didn't really adopt this a lot. However, I will break from the standard presentation and talk a bit more about web application firewall and about technical security. Usenix Enigma has a hard 20 minutes limit. Here I get to speak 30, 40 minutes. So I'm less stressed, less nervous, and I have more time to dig a bit deeper when things become interesting. Okay, as Seba said, we're a direct or a technically we're a semi-direct democracy. So we do have a parliament that we elect like normal countries do, but we also vote a lot. We vote like 4 times a year in Switzerland, at least 4 times a year. And that is referendums. When parliament discusses a law, people can say, we don't like this law, we're going to collect signatures, and when they bring together enough signatures, 50,000 actually, they can force a vote on a new law. And we collect them, and like 4 times a year, we go to vote on these referendums. And people can also propose something new. There it takes you 100,000 signatures, and then we're going to do a vote on that. That has advantages, that had disadvantages. Sometimes it's crazy, sometimes it makes a lot of sense, but the whole political culture is built around this. So people will constantly threat in parliament, if you're not going to compromise on this, then we're going to collect signatures. So this has a limiting factor, and also actually brings sense and reasons to a lot of things in parliament. And people are not so much protest voters or electors, because they know they can always stop government in a public vote if they don't like the law. Meaning we have, let's say, relatively reasonable politicians, and they better behave or we'll stop them with a ballot in our hands. So we do this 4 times a year. And because it's 4 times a year, this somehow has to scale. How does it scale? We have 30 years practice of mail-in ballots in Switzerland. Over 90% of the population in Switzerland is using paper mail to submit their votes. 15 or 20 years ago, the first pilot project with online voting started. So people not submitting a mail-in ballots, but people submitting a HTTP request with their vote. This has been 20 years in development right now, and the peak adoption was 2%, and then the system had to be stopped. So there was a lot of research and development that is still ongoing, but obviously if you peak at 2% after 20 years, there's also a lot of disasters involved. And I'm going to talk about this. It makes a compelling story. A very typical Swiss story, but I think there is a lot to learn about this for other countries as well, especially a final report that was released in December 2020. So that is another peak of this whole development. And that report is definitely applicable outside of Switzerland as well. It's the core knowledge, what we know today, what is wrong about online voting, or what should be made to really deliver a secure online voting. And we don't have this in Switzerland. We're still working on it. As you maybe know, Estonia has online voting for more than 10 years now. They trust that. From a Swiss perspective, we kind of think Estonia is speed over security. They quickly introduced it, and now they're improving it constantly. I think they have a decent system now, but it was definitely not secure when they introduced it. But somehow they're happy with that. So that's okay. We just have a different approach to this. Switzerland pays a lot of attention to security over speed. That's why we don't have a working system right now. So this is that. Switzerland has lots of mail-in ballots, and Switzerland, as most countries, has a really complicated process behind votes. People going to an election and placing their paper ballot or typing on a computer screen to submit their vote usually don't have an idea how complicated the process is behind the scenes. In Switzerland, as in many, many other countries, that process was strongly digitalized over the course of the last 20, 30 years. What you see here is a diagram from a threat model that was published in a paper in 2019 at the University of Zurich. And the yellow frames and exclamation points are the biggest dangers. And all the other stuff is what's happening as well around it. There are a lot of people, stakeholders, and a lot of electronic systems involved here. And most of them have been introduced throughout the years without ever thinking about security. These are administration processes. They're happening behind the scenes. People aren't even aware that exists. But if you start to think about it from a security perspective, you realize, hold on, a nation state attacker would definitely have the ability to mean a threat or menace this process or interact with it or attack this process. And with the whole discussion around the US elections 2020, of course, all these processes come into the spotlight now. And this has happened in Switzerland as well the last few years. Why did it happen? Because of online voting. Because online voting is so controversial that people started to think about, hey, hold on, if online voting is so problematic, are we really sure that our traditional mail-in ballots or the on-site voting is much more secure? And this paper here, you can look it up on the internet, it's public, of course, is proved that no, that is not very secure either. And we have now, there is now a development happening that people are looking at these processes and they're about to be secured. There is a lot of work to be done. I'm not entirely happy with the way it's running now, but at least we see development now, and we have several provinces or cantons, as we call them in Switzerland, that have acknowledged, yes, there is security or there is a potential security problem, and we need to look into that, and some of the software has to be secured or the processes have to be secured. So that is how complex that mail-in ballots are in Switzerland, and then you add electronic voting on top, and it gets even more complex, namely because of the encryption and because of the clients involved. So the electronic system around mail-in ballots are obviously, they're like B2B applications. There are administration people working on them from different administrations. When the voters get involved, then you have a B2C application with lots of unpatched browsers submitting their votes in a hopefully secure way. So this gets really hairy. And then you want to have vote secrecy, of course, and integrity of the votes. So you want to protect this without giving away the identity of the voters. And it's a substantial amount of complexity involved here. That's why after 20 years of development, we don't have a system yet. Good. And this is how a Swiss election ballot looks like. It's a relatively simple election ballot in the sense that it's only 7 votes or 7 people in here. That is a mid-sized Swiss canton, and this could be 20, 30 lines in here. What is a bit special about Switzerland is that you're allowed to replace names on an election list. So this is the Green Liberal Party here. They're the newcomers in Switzerland. And the person who filled out this vote replaced 3 names with additional names, also from other parties. That is perfectly legal in Switzerland. Of course, it makes counting bloody cumbersome and very, very complicated. So complicated, you need electronic systems to support the counting, because counting this by hand is so error prone. Bonus points if you spot the content manager from Butteville in Switzerland. Small village. I've never been there, but whatever. Good. However, electronic voting is obviously a very, very stupid idea because of computers. I mean, it's computers that make electronic voting so dangerous. I'm summarizing this with a quote from Bruce Schneier, who concluded in a piece for The Atlantic a couple of years ago, we simply cannot build an internet voting system that is secure against hacking because of the requirement for a secret ballot. And that is what I just mentioned. You need to have the secret ballot, or it's probably not a democracy. And the constitution or the voting laws, they guarantee a secret ballot. So the vote is going to be encrypted, and it has to be encrypted. However, you need to make sure that nobody is able to stuff in additional ballots or decrypt the ballots and drop the ballots that the person doesn't like. So you kind of need to guarantee that the ballot is recorded and counted properly, and on top, that no other ballots were entered fraudulently into the process. There are guarantees involved, and the Swiss law expects individual verifiability, and that means the system needs to guarantee the voter that it recorded the vote correctly. the Swiss systems did this with a return code, and the return code is personal. So with your paper ballot, you get the paper ballot at home, you fill it out, and then instead of submitting it by mail, you go into your browser and type it in, and then server tells you if you're voting for the content manager from Buttville, your return code is 7744. And that would be your personal return code for that person. And then you check that on your paper print and say, yeah, the number is correct. So my vote is recorded correctly. That is the individual verifiability that guarantees, yes, the vote was not manipulated by a man in the middle. It was stored correctly on the server. And a different person would get a different return code for the same person. Now, the universal verifiability builds up an encrypted or a chain. So to say, it's no blockchain, but it's mathematical proofs, one after the other. These are zero knowledge proofs, really complicated cryptography that I don't really understand it. Actually, I don't really understand it a bit. I just know what it does, but how it does it, that is beyond my knowledge. As I said, I'm a medievalist, I'm a medieval historian, and I'm not a mathematician. So what they do, by linking the records, they prove that nothing was stuffed. And there are multiple systems or so-called control groups involved that control each other. And the protocol is done in a way that a single valid control group, so one control group that is not corrupted, would be able to identify and cry wolf. So you would have to take out 4 independent control groups to attack the vote and manipulate it. That is the theory or the protocol or what the law expects. And but Bruce Schneier here says that's not possible. You're not going to do this because the encryption or the system is so complicated, you cannot implement this in a secure way unless you compromise on the secrecy of the vote. And if you want to guarantee the secrecy of the vote, then you open the door to manipulation of the votes. If you think of the CIA triad, so confidentiality, integrity, availability, either you have confidentiality or integrity of the vote. You cannot have both here, according to Bruce Schneier. And it's definitely really complicated. That's actually where a lot of problems are in Switzerland, or in our story with online voting in Switzerland. So online voting is obviously extremely stupid or dangerous. It's so complex. It's really, really hard. And nobody has pulled this off in a proven 100% secure way. Estonia is doing a good job, but people are criticizing Estonia about details of the protocol where people say that's not really working with you guys, or that is a weakness of your system, or it doesn't have these capabilities. So for the experts, it's really hard. So you would wonder, yeah, why would anybody actually want to do online voting then if it's so complicated and so dangerous? I mean, our democracy depends on this, and Switzerland touts itself as a 730-year-old democracy. So you better pay attention because there's some value in this, in the political process. The problem is there are valid reasons for online voting as well. And one of them is citizens living abroad. We have like 10% of our voting population living abroad around the globe. A voting period lasts 4 weeks. So if you happen to live within Europe, you're pretty well off. You get you mail in on paper ballots, you fill it out, send it back to Switzerland. Chances are in Western Europe, this will be done in time most of the time. And if it's not, nobody will tell you. It will be just too late, abandon. When you're living outside Europe, South America, a lot of Swiss people live in South America, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, for example, that doesn't work. I mean, they regularly get their mail-in ballots the last week. It's sent in Switzerland, takes 2-3 weeks to arrive in Buenos Aires, and it will never be back in time. So your vote is going to be discarded. You can just about forget to submit it. And they have a strong lobby. I mean, they're 10% of the voting population. That is substantial. And they have a strong lobby, and they want online voting. The constitution or the voting law guarantees them to vote, and we don't have a process that works for them unless they live in Western Europe. Citizens living abroad very often cannot participate in votes. That is bad. And now, of course, if you do this 4 times a year, we cannot call them to the embassy and tell people, hey, you travel to Buenos Aires 4 times a year, and then you fill in your vote in the embassy and they submit it to Switzerland. It's not going to work. I mean, these are large countries and it's happening 4 times a year. It's not a party. It's a standard process. People are not taking day off to go voting in Switzerland or abroad. It's happening all the time. This has to be smooth and seamless. So they have to be able to do this at home, and they are strongly calling for online voting and have been for many years. Then we have visually impaired and quadriplegic voters. These are people that are not able to fill out a paper ballot themselves. They need an assistant. As it happens in some jurisdictions, they cannot choose the assistant themselves. So an administrative person or somebody assigned by the administration will visit them at home and fill out the paper ballot for them. I mean, there is no voting secrecy involved here, and they're not even getting to choose their assistant themselves. And even if they need to trust that person, I mean, the paper ballot is on paper, and the visually impaired person cannot check that the paper ballot was filled out correctly. It just has to sign it afterwards. And that is legally not correct, or on the constitutional level, that is no secret ballot. They're not very loud, but I think they have a very strong point. And no impaired person has sued government so far, but I wonder what would happen if they would start to sue government over secret ballots. You could now say, yeah, but you could do a Braille written ballot, of course, for visually handicapped people. Yeah, they could fill it out in Braille. The problem is the vote counters. They couldn't read it anymore. That is the problem at stake here. Filling it out is one thing, but you need to count them by hand in 2,500 communities across Switzerland, and they don't read Braille writing. So that is the problem at stake here. And we don't have a solution for them. With a screen reader, this has been proven to work. The existing system have certifications from blind people that, yes, I'm able to vote here in a secure way. So they are calling for this, not very loud so far, but I do think they have a point. Then formally invalid ballots, you saw how complicated a Swiss ballot can be. And when it is so complicated, of course, people make a lot of mistakes. Before we start the presentation, Seba told me that the Dutch elections just had the problem that a lot of people doing mail-in ballots stuffed their identity card or the record together with the ballot in the same envelope. That is illegal in the Netherlands as much as it is illegal in Switzerland. You cannot do this. That is in Switzerland an invalid ballot. And that still happens. We do this 4 times a year. But when you think of the secret ballot, then nobody will tell you when you do this. I mean, but it's meant to be secret. So you could fill out a formally invalid ballot your whole life, and it's always getting thrown to the trash can. And nobody's going to tell you ever. And of course, I don't know if people do this their whole life, but we have invalid ballots constantly, namely in elections, because election ballots are much more complicated. The yes/no votes of referendums, they're relatively simple, but people make mistakes. They forget to sign it, or they stuff the envelopes the wrong way, or they make a cross instead of a yes, or whatever. In elections, that can be up to 10% of the votes. And I mean, that's substantial. Think about it. 10% of the votes not being counted. That is a problem for a democracy. I mean, you have an insufficient amount of voters going to vote. We have the same problems everywhere. And then from those that go to vote, 10% are thrown away. That is bad. And with electronic voting, you would end up with formally correct ballots. That would be an advantage of that system. And then, as I said, security issues of physical voting. Voting in the voting office and counting by hand is really very secure. I think I can say it. So, and most Western countries have good processes around that, namely when you count by hand. But as I said, the process is complicated. There are a lot of electronic systems involved, and they have their weaknesses. And one thing I like to quote a lot is counting ballots like this. You do this on a computer. What is going to happen is the vanilla ballots that nobody tampered with are going to count it as list votes by hand, maybe put on a balance. They're putting them on a balance, and then they have the balance counter. That happens. And the other ones are typed in on a computer keyboard in a FAT client software or via a browser in an online software. A ballot like this one, or let's say this ballot, would not be counted by hand. It would be counted on a keyboard, and the software would count it and throw out the number in the end. And of course, that software better be secure and transparent. And of course, these are black box softwares, and there are hardly any public security audits of this software. And there are many different systems around in Switzerland. I think there are like 3 major systems that many provinces use, and then a lot of local ones that individual provinces use. And there we see the biggest security concerns with these systems. And this is also where things are happening now. People are improving them. So the security is of the physical voting process, namely with mail-in ballots and complicated ballots that need to be counted by electronic means. I've talked to election officials, and they said, we forgot how to do ballot counting by hand in the mid-90s. We haven't done it ever since. And nobody has the knowledge how to do this anymore. And they're sure there was a lot of errors involved. I mean, these ballots are so complicated, and get the number of votes correct is very hard. And you need special processes and checking, etc. And that's all gone because people are used to type them in on computer nowadays, and have been for 20 years. We couldn't go back anymore. If you decided to do this by hand now, 100% by hand, we wouldn't really know how to do it anymore. Good. This is Switzerland, a detailed map. We have like 26 cantons. I don't know how many of them Belgium has. We're widely federalistic. Our democracy is said to be 700 years old. That's of course not correct. Our constitution is 150 years old on 1848. We have the base of our constitution was written in 1848, and it was modeled after the US constitution. Quite a lot is modeled after US constitution, in fact. That's why the federal authority is very strong. And like you witnessed in autumn, the authority over the number of votes that we get in elections, the authority is with the province. So it's not the capital and the federal government who accepts a vote. It is the local government in a province who decides what a vote is. The provinces have almost complete authority over the voting process. There are very few directions from central government how they need to perform this. Yeah, there is some, but the central government is very reluctant to impose a lot of rules on the canton. It's widely federalistic. It's very heterogeneous how this is happening. However, when Switzerland went to start electronic voting trials, they realized that individual provinces don't have the know-how to pull off such a system on their own. So they gave the central government the authority to create a regulation over electronic voting. And I think that was a very good move. So the authority is still with the cantons, but the audits are carried out by the federal government or the federal chancellery, which is a body within the government. And they have a lot of knowledge accumulated, obviously, over the course of 20 years. So they're like the arbiter or the referee, and they say, this system is good, that system is bad. And I guess that makes a lot of sense because namely the smaller, the more rural communities, cantons, there are small ones around here with below 100,000 citizens. I mean, expecting them to provide a secure voting system or run a secure voting system that is prone to be attacked by foreign state actors, forget it. They couldn't, of course. Even the big ones are struggling. Good. So what is the timeline? So in 2000, they started with the first pilots. The Canton of Geneva, the European Central City, Geneva, which is very strong in the United Nations, started in 2004. As it turned out, Geneva is a very important canton in this whole story. Geneva is the place where Calvinism was created. Geneva is very important in the Age of Enlightenment, and somehow Geneva saw it as its historic mission to bring online voting to the country and perhaps the world. I think there was a feeling of a historic mission in Geneva after they started in 2004. In 2008, a Spanish company entered the Swiss market. It was called Seitel, and it teamed with the Swiss canton, Neuchâtel, which is one of the smaller ones, to bring online voting to Switzerland. Seitel is one of the leading companies for electronic support system in the world. They do this around the globe. And they also do electronic voting. So this electronic system that support the voting process in the background, namely the aggregation of the results Sunday night across the country and throw out the results quickly, that is a key capability of Seitel. However, Seitel is a campaign company, obviously. Most countries vote every 4 years. Switzerland is voting 4 times a year, and Seitel doesn't have practice with doing that. And they realized this in the years after 2008. In 2009, another development started. There was a consortium, a group of 8 cantons joined, and they commissioned a system with the American company Unisys they have a Swiss daughter company, and it would start to develop a voting system for these 8 cantons. In 2011, or put this differently, you see individual cantons joining, setting up system. That is very typical. So you have a national program that starts in around 2000 in Switzerland, and the first few years, the provinces get to do this on their own. They let them run. Make your first experiences, and then after 5-10 years, the federal government started to establish a joint steering committee, because formally the federal government or federal administration has the legal right to oversee this or the legal duty to oversee this. And after the first couple of years, they slowly started to get going. That is very typical for Switzerland. And I think it's a proven method. Have the cantons try out something and then bring them together and start a dialogue. What is good? What is bad? What do you need to improve? Things were looking really good. 2015 were national elections, and there the National Steering Committee 2 months in front of the election, I think it was 2 months in front of the national elections, it did a review or published a review of the existing 3 or 4 systems, and it declared the consortium system meant to be used by 8 cantons for their foreign population, namely for the foreign population, was not accepted as a tool or were not accepted for online voting. And that was a shock, of course. For the 8 cantons who had built this system for 5-7 years, it was a real shock that it was not allowed to be used in the national elections. And they dropped the system like a hot potato. They were, whoa, we abandoned ship. We're done. So the system died within probably 2 weeks. It had been developed for many years, 6-8 years. Then federal government or federal chancellor says, nope, you're not good enough. Your architecture is lacking. The following points are not working. Your threat model, your architecture, your encryption is not good enough. We don't accept you. Please go back and improve. And they say, no, we're done. We're stopping. This is no fun. And for the people involved, that was a real shock. When the cantons involved, that was bang. They thought they were in good track up to 2015, and then bang, stopped. The first system died. Seitel realized by then that they were not a campaign company. And running systems quite in a continuous way. There is like constantly some votes happening on the province or even on a city municipality level happening in Switzerland, like every weekend. We're constantly in voting mode. Media is constantly talking about votes and elections, and you're always in production. And Seitel was used to, we go to a country, we set up our servers, we do an election campaign over 2 months, and then we go home, or we take the servers to the next country. And that's not how Switzerland works. You're always in production mode. And they joined with Swiss Post, and Swiss Post created their own online voting offering based on a Seitel software. And that was meant as a joint venture, and a very good complementary joint venture. So Seitel, the Spanish company, they're the voting and the encryption experts, and Swiss Post is very good at operating servers. I mean, they're a national logistics company. They transport all the mail-in ballots, so 90% of the votes are mail-in ballots. They're handled by Swiss Post, and Swiss Post probably said to itself, if somebody is going to replace or steal the mail-in ballots market, it's better be us. We're going to cannibalize this together with Seitel, but we don't want anybody else to eat our cake. It's got to be us. That's how they joined. And they attempted to improve the Seitel system with the new federal regulation. So every few years, the federal administration imposes new, stricter rules on online voting. It's getting harder and harder. It's steps on a ladder that you need to climb. It's quite demanding. And in 2015, 16, 17, they declared for the national election in 2019, you need to do this and this and that and get going. And in 2017, the federal chancellor, the administrative person in top there, announced that expects 2/3 of the Swiss canton to have some sort of an offer on internet voting offer by 2019, especially for the citizens living abroad, but also for certain local groups. And that was a wake-up call. When that was on the major news, all the critics of electronic voting, they say, oh, hold on, this is for real now? They haven't been doing this for 50 years. Like, they actually want to introduce this. Hold on, this has to stop. And before that, people would probably not take this very serious, but once this was made, that announcement was made, they were coming out of the closet, so to say, and they were rallying their lines, ultimately collecting signatures to force a popular vote to make online voting illegal, because Bruce Schneier, all the good arguments against it. That started really in 2017. 2018, Geneva realized that the new regulation, or that universal verifiability, that is these control groups checking each other and the mathematical zero knowledge proofs, is really hard to implement, and it's more expensive than they expected. There are also local political quarrels involved. So the government changed, or different people were in charge, and the system suffered from that. So like the political protection for that project was gone, and it was abandoned. First, the development stopped, and in 2019, they terminated. After 15 years, Geneva stopped the development of its system. It invested millions in 3 generations of electronic voting system. Geneva really pushed the system forward. Geneva went from a black box, very obscure black box system, to a fully transparent open source system over the course of 15 years, but they couldn't finish it. They teamed with a Swiss university to develop a new electronic voting system that has been published, that received very, very good critics, very good feedback, but they were not able to put it into code. They weren't finished. The system has been published, and the university is now working on finishing the code. But the code will, I mean, having code is one thing, but you need to run it afterwards as well. And that is also very complicated. Geneva had a lot of experience, and that is now all gone. That was terminated and abandoned in 2019. So the consortium died, Geneva gives up, what's left is Swiss Post. So we have the mainstreaming attempt, Geneva quits, and the road was free for Swiss Post in 2019. The regulation would say, if you want to do this on the national level, you need to do a certification. There were different levels of certification involved, but Swiss Post attempted the full-blown 100% certification. And there it would say you need to publish the source code. You've done closed source publication. Your Spanish friends have a closed source e-voting system. You publish this now. You publish the source code. And you also have to run a 4-week bug bounty contest. Right? They call this a public intrusion test, but it's a bug bounty. It's a bug bounty with substantial bounties. And we nailed this. I worked, back in the day, I worked for Swiss Post. Disclaimer, I still work for Swiss Post, but only a tiny bit. But I worked a big deal for Swiss Post, and I worked a big deal for the online voting system for Swiss Post. I worked in the defense of the online voting system, Swiss Post. So when they did the bug bounty, that looked really good. That is taken from the report from Swiss Post, from this bug bounty. It was running for 4 weeks. And you have a pyramid of findings here. It's a German report, but it says in the best practice section, we have 16 findings, and then intrusion into the system, destruction of votes, breaking vote secrecy, a detectable vote manipulation or undetectable vote manipulation, all 0 findings. So nobody was able to really attack the live system and manipulate a single vote. Nobody pulled this off. The top bounty would have been 50,000 Swiss francs. Nobody was able to claim anything of that sort. The money was there. Nobody claimed it. And it was not for a lack of researchers. We observed 700 individuals attempting to at least scan or then maybe attack the system. I mean, 700, that is a substantial number. They advertised this at DEF CON, at the e-voting village. And there were a lot of international experts attacking it. I have to say, a lot of them have been casual penetration testers. No special voting experience, voting knowledge. I would say if more voting experts would have teamed with the application security experts, more would have been possible. I'll return to that later on. First, let me talk a wee bit about the 16 findings. You're seeing 2 of the findings here on the right. Actually, it's 3 of the findings. 2 of them are open. The first one is a really cool one. I made sure that the person who submitted that got 200 Swiss francs. And it says the following. When I do a clear text connection on your reverse proxy and port 443, then Apache, I learned this the hard way, Apache does a 400 response, a clear text response. You talk clear text to encrypted port, but Apache is kind enough to tell you in clear text, this is a bad request. You're not doing an encrypted request. And as it happens, we return the STS header in that clear text response. And according to the RFC, you're not expected or you're not allowed to return an STS header in clear text. So that is a violation of the protocol. It is a relatively subtle violation. I don't think it is, or nobody was able to explain me why it is a major security problem. It probably isn't. But technically, you're not allowed to return the STS header in a clear text connection. 200 Swiss franc. I thought that was a hilarious finding. That's really cool. And we fixed it. That's easy to fix. You just need to do it. So that was a finding. CSP, of course, content security policy. They couldn't get the unsafe eval fixed in time. We were aware we had this coming. It came, gave them, I think, $100-200. And then there were special error messages. Some of the error messages had XSS protection header twice, which is a misconfiguration, got 100 Swiss francs. Then we had to enable 1 of 2 not so great ciphers, CBC ciphers that didn't provide forward secrecy. There were findings then right before the process or the bug bounty started, a vulnerability was published in one of the open source libraries, and it wasn't possible to fix this within 2 days. And when somebody found out, great, there was a dependency problem. That wasn't the latest version. And then we patched this during production, during the process. This was an exercise. I think we passed this nicely, but it was a valid finding. There are findings like that. They're real, but they're best practice findings, and they're not really big security problems. One security problem was it was possible to inject an IP address in a non-important log file. That was maybe the biggest one. That was qualified as low, but it's more than informative. I mean, it was a log file injection of an IP address. Only an IP address could be injected, but it could be injected inside log file. And that wasn't good. And a bit embarrassing for me, that was my fault. I should have caught that. So that was the bug bounty program, and that could have been great. I mean, if you look at that, after 700-900 researchers, yeah, you tap on your shoulder, think, well done, we nailed this. The problem was in the source code. The problem was in the source code, and that was the source code. So the two programs were running in parallel. And maybe you heard the news. Heard the news about the Swiss Post online voting disaster in 2019. And that was about the source code. Of course, the media mixed it all up. But what was happening, the source code was considered a disaster. And within days, they had vulnerabilities. I'm able to steal the complete vote. I'm able to steal anything. They were not able to do this on the live system, because protection, because web application firewall, because they didn't even try. But they were able to prove in the source code, I can steal the votes easily. Or they were able to inject votes and stuff like that. Or the control group could be manipulated and nobody would detect it, stuff like that. And within 3 weeks, they had 4 highly critical findings, and then the system had to be stopped. So within 3 or 4 weeks, these are the major headlines. They had 3 highly critical attacks proven in the source code. And of course, it was the first time the source code was put out for public scrutiny after 15-20 years of development. And exactly that happened, what you would expect to happen. Swiss Post did not have this coming. They were surprised it happened. They had obtained certificates that said, hey, this is good. But actually, nobody had looked at the source code line per line. They had done the development process. They had done the protocol, all the nice reviews, the thick reports, the expensive reports. But then when you sit down and look at the source code line by line, you realize, hey, no, that's not good. There were people within the company who told the management, and management, of course, they were in a hard situation. I mean, you have an expensive report for one of the big 4 companies, and you have a few nerds to tell you, hey, that's not good. You better pay attention, and who are you going to trust? So it was really, for them, it was a hammer, a bang on the ears. They didn't expect this to be that bad. I kind of expected it to be bad, probably not as bad as this, but I wasn't really surprised. I was I was still happy we did it good in the operating, and the source code, I wasn't involved at all. I mean, I didn't get to see the source code before the publication anyway, so I couldn't tell this. Very important researchers, you see 2 of them here, Sarah Jamie Lewis, Vanessa Teague from Australia, and Olivier Pereira from Leuven University in Belgium was very important as well. They were a team of 3, and they discovered the 3 major vulnerabilities. 1 or 2 of them were discovered by different teams as well, but they had 3 of them. So they are, in the end, that's the 3 people who took out the system. And then it happened what had to happen. The system was not allowed for the national election 2019. Swiss Post had to stop its own system. If they wouldn't have done this, the national government would probably have declared it unfit for the national election. And it became clear that a sort of a rebooting process is due. They couldn't continue with that anymore. That happened in 2020, and they invited 20 scientists and industry experts for a dialogue between the government and industry or science to talk about online voting. And they asked me to be the moderator of this process. Why me? I'd exposed myself in the public discussions as somebody who knows a bit about this, who's interested in it, but has a more or less neutral stance on this. I don't know if it's really a good idea, but I think there are very good reasons to try it out. And I think it is a political decision if you want to have this. And probably my PhD helped as well. And they thought Christian is able to bring all these people together. So I was the moderator of that process. People involved, obviously, people from the Swiss universities, the EPF in Lausanne and ETH, the best known Swiss universities as well, but then also international ones, like people who had worked on the vulnerabilities. Olivier Pereira from Belgium and Venice Satig were invited to join in, and they played a strong role in this. They really participated, as did most of the scientists here on the list. And that process worked with a questionnaire. They received a questionnaire with 60 questions, and they probably had 1, 2, or 3 days to fill out the questionnaire. The questionnaire alone altogether were 400 or 500. The responses to the questionnaires, that was 400 or 500 pages of text. That was really a lot. And then we would identify areas where there was no consensus, things that we would take into a discourse, into a discussion. The discussion was meant to be several on-site workshops, but then the pandemic hit and we had to think of this differently. And we decided to do this on an online platform. And we would set up a GitLab instance and discuss 50 questions in 10 or 12 topical areas as issues. Like, here is a question as a GitHub issue, now discuss this. I, as the moderator, would guide the discussion and bring together the different opinions and write down a consensus position. I'll try to come up with a consensus position that they would then accept or continue to edit. And for these 50 questions, we ended up with, let's say, 45 or so. We had a consensus position in the end that was filled into a report in the end. Here you have the timeline. The dialogue started in April 2020, lasted up to June, early July. Then there was 1 or 2 sidetracks with additional research happening outside, like things where the government realized or administration realized we cannot really discuss this in the group because it's like new research. Somebody has to look into this question, it hasn't been discussed. Nobody has an opinion on that. Let's commission research by individual participants that did this with 2 or 3 topics. And then in November, they published the scientific report. That is an 80 pages report with all the summaries from the questionnaire. So for all the questionnaire questions, there was a summary. And then the discussion had its own summaries. So 60 questions in the survey and 50 questions in the online platforms, over 100 questions brought together then in the big summary that's 80 pages long. And afterwards, in December, there even was a political report that took out the scientific report and is trying to put this into more political form. And now the political process is happening. I mean, honestly, what the science or what we did with the scientists was a wish list, or look, this is how this is supposed to be clean. That's not necessarily what can be possibly implemented, or somebody has to pay it in the end. Or maybe you need to find a compromise. Maybe the compromise is going to be acceptable or it's not acceptable from a security standpoint. But it's obvious that politics or administration is now working on the recommendations and finding ways to implement this or finding reasons to throw it out the window. I think what I've heard so far, they're taking this serious, but it's never going to be 100%. And I think nobody is really expecting this to be 100% what the scientists advocated. This is this expert dialogue, so the scientific dialogue from November, and you can download it from here. That exists in English. It's in English, French, and German, maybe even Italian. And that is a very good read. It's interesting for anybody, but if you're really working on election security, that is, I think, a milestone, because it's the first time that government officials have done a structured dialogue with scientists and scholarly voting experts to bring together the state of the art or state of knowledge and formulate advice or recommendations to the administration how to do this in a secure way. And that points far beyond Switzerland. I mean, some of the assumptions in here or some of the topics discussed, particularly Swiss topics, but a lot of it applies generally. I mean, cryptography is the same around the world, maybe outside Australia, if you know that discourse, but mathematics happens to work around the world, and what they discovered here or formulated as a recommendation here in Switzerland applies to anybody. So that is really good. And you should go and read it. I'm going to pick up a couple of topics in here now. What is interesting, takeaways, and then we come to the summary, and then we're done with your Q&A. So we're getting there, even if I talk a long time. Key recommendations of the dialogue. There has to be a strict hierarchy of specifications. You cannot do a high-level specification and then write code. That's not going to work. That's how they've done it. It's not working. You need hierarchies of specifications, and you need to be able to prove that the lower level specification implements the higher level specification down to the pseudo and the code level. And this has to run over several layers in a mathematically clean way, and you need to be able to prove that it works. And that is new, and that is hard, and we don't have this so far. There is no voting protocol that really implements it. Maybe the new one from Geneva, I couldn't really tell, but definitely not what we've seen from Seidel. And they're working on this right now. There has to be diversity in hard and software. They would conclude you can do a lot of hardening and you can do a lot of secure coding, but beyond a certain barrier, it gets really expensive to improve your code, and the money is better invested in a second implementation of the same software, and then you run the two in parallel, and they need to be in sync, and they need to have the same result. So an attacker needs to attack both of them at the same time without you noticing it. And that money is much better invested into more and more hardening. So the diversity of the 4 control groups is vital. Do this in different programming languages, multiple implementations in different programming languages, different operating system, different compilers, different hardware. Then it's going to be substantially more secure. That's going to be really expensive and complicated. But there was a clear recommendation. You need a maximal level of transparency. Developing a closed source and then publishing in the end, it's not going to cut it. Tried this, didn't work. Namely, in development, the scientists strongly recommend an open source development. They did not strictly say it is impossible to do this closed source, but they said it needs a maximum of transparency. And if you're not going to do this open source, it's going to be very hard. Also, in terms of public scrutiny, people will not be interested or be less interested to test your system if it's not open source. If it's open source, you can profit from a lot more eyes. And if you would be able to open source your cryptographic libraries, they could become standard libraries for the general use cases of this cryptography beyond Switzerland. Then other people would look at it and use it in their own system. And the vulnerabilities found in that country, you could profit. Or the blockchain people could start to use it because it's the same technology. Some of the technology is the same that you use in online voting and in blockchain. The zero knowledge proof, homomorphic encryption is bleeding edge mathematics cryptography, and they could profit if it would be used in different systems. Many of these cryptographic routines don't have a standard implementations. That's why they're so error prone. And if they would open source their cryptographic library, maybe they would become the standard implementation, and then they would profit from it. And that was the recommendation by the scientists. We'll see if this is coming through in the new regulation. And then go and look into voting security beyond internet voting. The electronic processes around, they have a lot of problems as well. There were some of the recommendations. In the end, it's an 80 pages report worth reading. Good, let me sum this up. Switzerland is voting 4 times a year, mostly by mail, which makes Switzerland a very good test bed for online voting because you get to do a lot of test runs throughout the years. There has been an iterative process with strict supervision on a federal level. Federal government has been fairly lax, maybe the first 10 years, but then they become stricter and stricter. And even if the media dubbed them as really not up to the task, I think the federal administration has done a very good job bringing the real scientists together. It took a long time, but we're on good tracks. And we have public scrutiny now. We have science in the boat. They definitely know what they're doing. And it's not easy to get this in place. And the buggy systems were stopped before widespread adoption. And that's all we can ask for, I think. So we had this expert dialogue in 2020. One of the recommendations is you have to continue an expert dialogue with scientists beyond this individual dialogue we carried out in 2020. And it looks good as if in 2020, the dialogue would be established for the long run. So now they're taking the recommendation and writing the new law, taking up the recommendation, do new regulation. And then once that is done, the permanent dialogue will probably be put in place beyond 2021, 2002. And Swiss Post is back in the game. They are working hard to come back in 2022 with their revised online voting system. No other participant has dared to enter the market so far. And I think it's hard to compete with Swiss Post because they made it very clear, no matter the drawbacks, we're here to deliver online voting, no matter the costs. Yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A. I hope I didn't eat all the time that we had.
Well, you ate a lot of the time, Christian. You actually went over time, but
it's hard. Sorry.
No problem. It was super interesting. So we have also quite some people joined the live chat at the YouTube. So I'm looking there. I see some greetings from OWASP London. Greetings back. But now is the time to put some questions on the website, on YouTube, or here in the chat. I haven't seen any questions so far. I've seen about 50 people joining on YouTube.
Wow, so many.
Yeah.
Cool.
So maybe until we see some other questions popping up, am I correct in understanding that this online voting system has been used already or not yet?
They have been used in small trials. If you count the individual province or canton carrying out a vote with online voting involved, you have over 300 trials.
Okay.
So, I mean, if 8 Swiss cantons do this 4 times a year, you have 30 already. That's how you come to the number 300. The peak usage has been 2% of the vote, with, I think, 1.2% for the Geneva system and 0.9% for the Swiss Post system used in parallel, and then 91% mail-in ballots and 6-7% on-site votes. That's about the number.
That's quite low. Is it because of the fact that it was just low of trials, or was it because of people not adopting the online process?
Oh, they're not allowed to use it.
Okay.
So you have different this is called levels of certifications. When you think about how to do this properly and legally, then it gets really hairy and you end up with a system that is fairly complicated. But what they would go is, we want to use this for the foreign votes. And then you have like 10% of the voting population across the country living abroad, but in different cantons it may be much lower. And then they need to register for this, perhaps, or a lot of the voting population living outside Switzerland is not aware that they could use this, because they don't even deposit their address because it never works anyway. And then how do you tell them, hey, you have this option now in September the first time? So that's how the adoption was really low. Of course, there was a lot of science statistics involved. They looked at this attentively. And the people who were offered the option, they have like an adoption of 50% fairly quickly. After 2 or 3 campaigns, half of them would use it, and almost nobody would drop out anymore. So the people who would use it would continue to use it. They cannot be so bad. And people, the critics would say it's unusable, it's a very crappy system, whatever. But I think the numbers don't add up. And then in the 2010 years, there were also Swiss voters allowed to use it in like pilot communities, municipalities, scientifically identified good example cases, and they were closely accompanied, and there the numbers say the same. And once you try this out, you continue to use it because it's comfortable. It's easy to fill it a mail-in ballot and drop it in the mailbox, but it's just as easy to do it on a computer because you're on Facebook anyway.
So are there now concrete plans to roll it out towards a broader, I would say, audience?
That depends on the canton, of course. And the canton has to implement this, and then there will be the new regulation. And so far, we don't really know the new regulation. So Swiss Post is developing something new, revising their system without knowing the security that they need to deliver. They're in a tricky situation, honestly. I'm on and off on the sidelines of that project a wee bit. I'm not really involved anymore, but I counsel a wee bit on some of the talks. And it's hard. I mean, you develop something that you don't know the target.
And are the cantons then supposed to, I would say, take the system and deploy it themselves, or does Swiss Post offer this as e-voting as a service?
It's e-voting as a service.
Right. Okay.
And Geneva offered it as a service to the other cantons, which is politically very. It's a bit crazy, isn't it? I mean, you have the different one canton offering voting for the other canton. It's a wee bit complicated, and of course, then you have local animosities because certain cantons wouldn't want their vote counted by Geneva, not Geneva. I mean, that canton is nice, but not Geneva. When you had that, and then Swiss Post has a very good reputation in Switzerland.
I see there's a question of Eric that just joined us within Zoom. His question: what's considered as proof of identity for citizens in such a system?
That is superficially, it's a simple question. On a low level, it's fairly complicated. You have voting registers in Switzerland, and that's the registers of the inhabitants. So when you live in Switzerland, you need to register at your local municipality. The authority of a vote is with the province, but the province handles down the execution of the vote to the local jurisdiction, so your municipality. Switzerland happens on 3 levels: state levels, canton, province level, and municipality level. And the municipality level knows you because you live there, and they know if you're a citizen or not. And they send you the election ballots by mail because they know you, they know your address. And if you move to a new place, you register and you start to receive this automatically, and you throw it in the bin or you fill it out and return it. So that's
and maybe a follow-up question on that from me. How do you handle this with Swiss people who live abroad?
That is the point. When you leave your canton and live abroad, then you need to register for being a foreign national with your embassy in that country, and then you're being covered by the canton. no longer by your former municipality, but the canton has like a list of the foreign voters that the last time they were in Switzerland, they lived in that canton. It works like that. And then when you travel from one country to the next one and from one canton municipality to the next one, it gets very hairy. What is interesting now is on the lower level, when you walk into the voting office, how do you prove your identity? You prove your identity by holding the ballot in your hand. That is your proof of identity. Formally, you're obliged to sign it, but they cannot prove your signatures because they don't know your signature systematically. I mean, in a small municipality, they probably know it, but in a large municipality, nobody knows your signature. So having that ballot in your hand is your proof of identity. And the German term actually is proof of identity as a voter. It's a Stimmrechtsausweis. An Ausweis means proof of identity.
All right. So and then I have also a question from YouTube. So a question on the 200 Swiss franc bug bounty. Looked like a very trivial HSTS issue, possibly found by OWASP ZAP. Was there any professional pen testing done by a panel of different pen testing companies?
A ton of them throughout the years. I've read many pen testing reports, and the bug bounty stuff, what came up there was not found by all the previous penetration testing campaigns. And there were strong people involved, and they mix them, so it's not always the same company. I cannot really tell you much of it because I have an NDA as well, but there are a lot of Swiss pen testing companies, and I've seen a lot of different people work on these systems. What was interesting, I thought it was striking that in the public discourse, and the public discourse was fierce, that very few Swiss penetration testing companies, pen testers involved, or only security experts working in consultancy positions were taking part in this discourse in Switzerland. I thought it was striking how much they're not participating. Guess why? It's not because they're not interested, because I think a lot of these people have been working with the Geneva system, Swiss Post system, the Unisys systems. Throughout the years, there's so many of these pen tests, and a lot of findings were fixed. So we fixed so many of the findings, and the 16s that were found was the leftovers or the brand new ones. I mean, new vulnerability in a library comes out on Wednesday. We start a campaign on Saturday. It wasn't patched. Sure, was a decision not to patch it on Friday afternoon.
All right. Okay, great. And I'm looking at the Q&A. I'm not seeing any more other questions. So, Christian, I really want to thank you again for filling in last minute. It was really interesting. I recommend everyone to have a look indeed at that interesting report. I added it to the YouTube chat and the Zoom here. We're going to share it afterwards. Also, people will be able to have a look at the live stream. So we're editing it and wrapping it up as a YouTube film movie. And then people will be able to have a look at it afterwards as well. So thank you very much. I'll be sharing a last, would say, page with you. So let me just wrap this up if my sharing works. So thank you very much for having done that, Christian. So everyone who sees this, these are the dates of the next sessions we have in mind. So next April, third Thursday of April, we'll have Simon Bennett's on OWASP ZAP. So join us in our online communities. Obviously, we have a YouTube channel. You're seeing it here. If you see this, I would say click the subscribe link. If you like it, obviously. Join our meetup group, our LinkedIn group, our Twitter, our website, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and we're happy to see you back in the next time. And Christian, thank you. Maxim, also thank you for helping us out, and see you next time as well.
Thank you very much for having me. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Our pleasure.